Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Grey Matter, back by popular demand. My good friend and colleague, Jeffrey Rath. The episode that we recorded together a few months ago is the most watched one we've had in this program by a country mile, which is no surprise. Jeff is a man of strong opinions that are always fascinating. Before we get into a conversation with him in which he's going to do most of the talking, I want you to just notice my new background. A friend of mine, Will from Strong and Free Canada, was kind enough to donate a green screen and some lights. I'm not convinced it's made me look any better, but we do have this nice background now. So just want to do a shout out to Will and thank him for that. So without further ado, we have Jeffrey Rath. I'm not going to go into his biography because we did that in depth on a previous episode. If you want to hear all that, you can just go and visit it. Today, I want to focus more talking with Jeff about some recent events, things that are happening in the world that he has some strong and informed opinions about, and also talk about, especially about the APP and the progress of that. Before we get into the conversation, and I try to trigger Jeff into saying some things he'll regret. There's a few quotations, as always, we're going to start off the program with in honor of our guest. The first one is from P.J. O'Rourke, who wrote, "At the core of liberalism is the spoiled child, miserable as all spoiled children are, unsatisfied, demanding, ill-disciplined, despotic, and useless. Liberalism is a philosophy of sniveling brats." Spoiler alert. I think people know who I'm talking to there, or I'm talking about. The next one is someone who my friend Jeff quotes often, Niccolo Machiavelli, who famously wrote, "A sign of intelligence is an awareness of one's own ignorance." And finally, and you're seeing that there's a theme here in terms of our Prime Minister. Finally, from Leo Tolstoy, who wrote that an arrogant person considers himself perfect. This is the chief harm of arrogance. It interferes with a person's main task in life, which is to become a better person. All right. So, Jeff, welcome back to the program. Thanks for coming back to see us again.
Thanks. Hey, I had one of my favorite quotes to that list. And
absolutely. That's so about
to our present Prime Minister, especially when the quote would be applied to his father. But it was a quote from one of my favorite authors, Hunter S. Thompson, in his book, Generation of Swine. And Hunter S. Thompson said that most people think that politicians are real heroes, truly exciting people. This is wrong on its face. They are mainly dull people with corrupt instincts and criminal children. So, do with that.
Wow. So. Hey, I'm going to look that one up, and I'm going to use that on our future program.
All right. Swine. It was one of my, I think it's particularly appropriate, especially when you think about it in the context of Trudeau Sr. and Trudeau Jr. So there you go.
Yes, and unfortunately, well, dangerously, perhaps the Prime Minister does have children. So let's talk about some of the things that have been happening since the last time we talked. Just yesterday, I wanted to get your take on this. Mr. Justice Dunlop of the Court of Queen's Bench just ordered Deena Hinshaw to disclose a PowerPoint presentation and cabinet meeting minutes in an action regarding a declaration prohibiting school boards from requiring masks in schools, ruling that disclosure is in the interest of justice. The court ruled that a mere certificate claiming cabinet privilege is insufficient, and the court has ordered the province to adduce affidavit evidence in support of its position. This appears to follow the ruling made in the Ingram case, which you authored, which gets back to the by the way, the title of the show is "Want to Be Starting Something," in honor of kids. So what do you think about this? Do you think that that you've kicked open a door here, and that we're seeing a trend where courts are going to look behind some of these locked doors that the government's trying to keep shut?
I certainly hope so. I mean, that was my intention in bringing the application that we brought in the context of the allegations of cabinet privilege in the Hinshaw case. Certainly, Justice Dunlop went a lot further than Justice Romaine did in our case. one of the things that I really like about his judgment, and I think it directly goes to Dr. Hinshaw's overall credibility and competence as a physician, is that he states that both her duties as the Chief Medical Officer of Health and her professional obligations as a physician require her to be, require of her the utmost candor in answering questions and presenting information to the public. So, think about that in terms of all of her press conferences where, she goes on, bleats on and on about the, vaccines being safe and effective, et cetera, where it seems she was acting more as a vaccine salesperson than a competent physician, where, where she, basically was only talking about potential benefits of the vaccines and not advising people of the real harms that could be caused by these vaccines in the context of side effects and otherwise. And, and think about all of the things that she did that I suggest, smack of incompetence, including, the constant 2 or 3 month lag behind the science table of Ontario for approving treatments like fluvoxamine and other treatments that have been proven to save lives, people infected with COVID, right? So, obviously I continue to have grave concerns with regard to Dr. Hinshaw's competence, her continued employment by the government of Alberta as the Chief Medical Officer of Health, and certainly in regard to any reply that we're going to be making to the government of Alberta's responses to our written submissions in the Hinshaw case. We'll be raising Justice Dunlop's decision and reply to make sure that, Justice Romaine is fully aware of the implications of that decision in the context of our case.
Yeah, so it seems as though, you recall that when she was testifying, she really seemed to regard herself as not necessarily a mouthpiece, but as an extension of government. And she kept referring, and this is how we got there, is she kept referring to herself as someone who was, referring or giving advice to the government and cabinet. And that seemed to be her primary obligation, notwithstanding the fact that she described herself as the doctor whose patients are all Albertans. But what the court seemed to be rerouting her back to is an understanding that her principal role, her key role, is as the Chief Medical Officer of Health, is as the protector of the public, and that her main duty is to the public and not to government. That seems to be what's coming through, or the trend in these decisions. Maybe I'm overstating that, but that seems to be the way this is going, which is a real shift in the way that the courts have been viewing these matters. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, one of the other thing that I find fascinating about that case and that decision, just keep in mind, it's basically, it's NDP funded lawyers acting on behalf of a union trying to remap children's schools, right?
No sugarcoat it, Jeff.
So apparently, according to the union, teachers are too afraid of our children to teach them in a school setting without our children being masked and muzzled, right? So, that seems to be what that case is all about. But it's interesting that the law that they're creating in that case, is leading to the one thing that Rachel Notley probably is going to hate the most, which is transparency. Right. So it's the law of unintended consequences for any of these people that have these fascist tendencies that they want to lock people up and force children to wear masks and retard their development and their socialization and so on. That the courts are saying, well, no, we have to have transparency in and around these issues. And it may not be, and if Deena Hinshaw is attempting to do the, I was just following superior orders thing, I'm not really, exercising authority as Chief Medical Officer of Health, I'm just making recommendations to cabinet and then they tell me what to do, right? The judge in that case, Justice Dunlop, seems to be indicating if that's what's going on, that's a real problem. Yeah. So, so I think it'd be very hard for, and I think Justice Dunlop went so far as to say that that's the central issue of importance in that case. So I don't know how that case can succeed where ours would fail. Right. So I'm very interested in that, and obviously we'll be following those developments.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so switching gears. It turns out that, and I know you have your family has a very proud history of service in the Canadian military, and it turns out that the ensign that was on the uniforms of the soldiers who risked their lives to storm the beaches of Normandy, along with the Canadian flag, are now hate symbols, and that Canadians who chose to wave the Canadian flag on Canada Day in Ottawa were willingly subjecting themselves to police violence, arrests, and fines. What's your take on all of this?
To be honest, I haven't followed what went on today that closely. I was so disgusted with what was going on with Tamara Lich. I kind of boycotted Canada Day this year and deliberately didn't pay attention to anything that was going on because of the level of disgust that I had over the fact Tamara Lich was basically kidnapped from Alberta as a political prisoner and hauled to Ottawa for having her picture taken at an event that the court specifically allowed her to attend. So I wasn't really paying attention to it other than reading the news reports. And I did see the news reports that it was extremely poorly attended this year. And in fact, I heard the Crown prosecutor, and this was bizarre, in the bail hearing for Tamara Lich, complaining or blaming Tamara Lich for the poor turnout at this event, because everybody in Ottawa were so afraid that because Tamara Lich was in Ottawa that there might be violence at this event on Canada Day, right? Leaving aside, of course, the fact it was the prosecutors themselves that my understanding is chartered a private plane, no less, to fly Tamara Lich from Alberta to Ottawa in leg irons so that they could lock her up for a day, and then they had the lack of the lack of self-awareness actually go into court and argue that somehow or other Canada Day, being so poorly attended for our benighted Prime Minister was Tamara Lich's fault. I mean, it's all of that to me is just bizarre. And of course, we've been watching the ongoing issues around the Canadian flag since the peaceful convoy, the Castle protest in Ottawa. Where everybody on the Trudeau Jagmeet Singh side of the fence are now looking at the Canadian flag as a symbol of right-wing extremism, and that these poor, as I referred to them recently in a Western Standard column, these poor delicate souls, who are so easily triggered, by symbols of what used to be our national pride and what used to be, our pride in the Canadian Bill of Rights and the Charter of Rights and so on. So, for me, it's it's almost really sad. I think I was going to say laughable, but I think it's really sad that that we've got all of these people on the Trudeau side of the fence who now view the Canadian flag apparently as some sort of symbol of right-wing hate speech. Right?
Mm-hmm. We had I want to come back to Tamara Lich and go through that in detail. But just to finish off this topic, we had a guest on the program recently, an economist from Britain named Dr. Paul Fraters. And he's written a book recently where he basically posits the idea that really the only antidote to this kind of globalism, what our Prime Minister calls over-nationalism, that he says that we need to suppress this over-nationalism that the people like us call patriotism. What Dr. Frater says is that patriotism is really the only antidote to it. And so the globalists have a very specific agenda about suppressing and destroying this patriotic nationalistic feeling, because the more they destroy that, the more people are disposed to allow this globalist think to come in order to fill the vacuum. Do you agree with that analysis?
Yeah, to a large degree, I do, and I think it's the other part of it that really bothers them is that to a certain degree, patriotism, at its core is a form of populism, right? Mm-hmm. It's because it is intensely popular and it's something deeply rooted, in in a people or in a nation. We were all brought up, to believe in the values of Canada and to be proud to be Canadians. And, to the extent that creates a sense of popular identity that people can rally around, I can see that would be really threatening to the Jagmeet Trudeaus of the world, where they, are the Notley Trudeaus of the world, which, in the context of, people having a concept that they can rally around, in the face of all of this creeping socialism that we're trying to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's come back to Tamara Lich, because this is really important. I don't think many people understand that she's charged with a relatively minor criminal code offense of mischief. So she's not charged with treason or anything like that, mischief. She was already incarcerated once. She's been incarcerated again since the 25th of June. And she's got a decision coming up in the bail hearing in a couple of days. And now she's been cited at least twice on really what most lawyers would call ticky-tack bail violations, bail breaches. Do you want to talk about that and what you think?
Yeah, let's be clear here. Pedophile, nobody would be batting an eye that she was violating a bail. She certainly wouldn't be thrown back in jail or whatever it was. She'd get a stern talking to and again be released on her own recognizance or whatever. And and again, let's keep in mind, how minor in the context of the criminal code, a mischief charge is. I had, when I was a young criminal lawyer years and years ago, I had a client who was charged with break and enter and commit. Specifically, he took a cinder block, he broke his way into a coin-operated car wash, he smashed the car wash change box off of the wall so that he could get cab fare home after just having been released by the police for attempted theft of a vehicle over $5,000. They'd released him on his own recognizance. So anyway, I managed to plead this guy down to tampering with a vehicle under the Highway Traffic Act and mischief, for which he got a grand total of $300 in fines. $150 on the tampering with a vehicle under the Highway Traffic Act and $150 on the mischief. So, mischief charges typically in the context of Canadian law, especially when you're dealing with, someone who's a grandmother, she's a first-time offender, and then on top of it, leaving aside the fact that Tamara's not, in my understanding, isn't likely to be convicted in any event, of the charge. To me, it's just ridiculous that they're spending the money that they're spending persecuting this poor woman. Think about what it costs to throw her into remand in Medicine Hat, move her from remand to Edmonton, put her in a private plane, fly her across the country with a senior homicide detective from Ottawa, no less, found out. What did that cost? $50,000 or $60,000 to lock Tamara Lich up for Canada Day? Could have been $100,000 for all we know. Given the way the government bills and spends money. So let's say it's only $50,000. $50,000 to persecute a woman who's likely at best going to get a fine if they convicted her, right? Because keep in mind, with regard to the so-called counseling mischief charge that they've laid against Tamara Lich, right? She wasn't even in Ottawa when the trucks were parked on Wellington Street. Those trucks came in without her exhortation or without her direction from Quebec and Ontario. My understanding, having spoken directly to witnesses who were there in Ottawa when that was going on, and have spoken to Tamara herself, most of her activities in Ottawa with the freedom protesters was actually working with police to keep emergency access lanes, open on Wellington Street. So she wasn't counseling mischief or wasn't responsible for blocking Wellington Street or anything else. She was responsibly working with police to try to mitigate a situation that had arisen prior to her arrival in Ottawa. So, and then you talk to people that were there. A lot of the blockage of downtown Ottawa, wasn't by the protesters. It was the city of Ottawa graders and other road equipment to block access to downtown to keep the peaceful protesters out of downtown and off of Parliament Hill. And a lot of the blockage occurred in and around the Supreme Court was caused by the police setting up their base camp and center of operations on the lawn at the Supreme Court. So that wasn't the protesters. And somehow or other, this is all Tamara's, and she's being charged with mischief for exercising her rights under Section 2 of the Charter and Rights of Freedoms. So there's no doubt in my mind that Tamara is a political prisoner, and the real reason she's been incarcerated is that she scares the living hell out of the political establishment, because in a 2-week period, she proved herself capable of raising $20 million through GoFundMe and other platforms, which is more money than all of the Canadian political parties put together raised in the 2 years previous, including during a federal election campaign. So you've got to think that rattles the political establishment within the NDP and the Liberal Party to their core, right? So this is literally Tamara's jailing. This is literally the Empire Strikes Back, and she's being jailed as a political prisoner because she's a threat to the hegemony of the Laurentian elites. So that's my view of it.
So the precise allegation that she violated the terms of her bail, is it that she accepted an award at a Justice Center event? She was given I believe she was given a Freedom Award that was handed to her by, was it John Carpe? And that this is the essence of it? What specific term are they saying that she violated? She made some sort of public statement, protest statement by appearing there to receive an award?
Yeah, that's my understanding. I was checking in and out of the bail hearing the other day, and keep in mind, we didn't know for days what the alleged breach of recognizance was. Her mother didn't even know. Her sister didn't know, and her sister's her surety. So her surety didn't know what the alleged breach was, and we were all just speculating that it was because she showed up in a picture that was snapped of her standing next to Tom Marazzo, who, as I said in my Western Standard column, is on those really, 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 really naughty list, right? But Marazzo hasn't been charged with a crime. So, basically, and then on top of it, the photo that was taken, right? I think John Carpe is actually in the photo. So, and which the Crown didn't know after spending all of this money to leg irons and drag her across the country. They didn't even know that one of her lawyers was in the picture, and just several other of her lawyers. I mean, think about what the judge said the last time he chastised the court, with regard to the Crown continuing to try to lock Tamara up. They were told the last time, courts are not a political thought police. And the purpose of bail and revoking bail is to prevent people from committing a crime while they're waiting for their trial. Well, what crime was committed when she was standing next to Tom Marazzo in the presence of her legal counsel? When her original bail conditions were she couldn't contact anybody on the Trudeau naughty list, except, in the presence of legal counsel. Well, she was in the presence of legal counsel. I find it, it beggars belief that in the 2 seconds while this photo was being snapped, that she and Tom Marazzo had some secret Vulcan mind meld to plot the overthrow of the Trudeau regime, right? The whole thing is, to my way of thinking, is just complete prosecutorial overreach. And I certainly hope that the Justice of the Peace sees it as that. And certainly, if the Justice of the Peace doesn't, I can't imagine that that wouldn't withstand a bail review in front of a Justice of the Superior Court of Ontario and have her released like last time. My concern, though, and this is what people need to think about, is how troubling is it that that Tamara is being jailed, right? In this way for a crime that at best she's going to get a fine for if they convict her. And I mean, by the time they get around to her trial, she's already served 10 times more jail time than she could ever possibly get from the offense. I mean, this offends me as a lawyer at such a deep level. You have no idea. And I'm telling you, if I was a judge in that court, I'd be really tempted to cite the prosecutors in contempt and lock them up the number of days that they've forced Tamara to serve, in remand, in isolation. I mean, this isn't Canada anymore. Like, I have no idea what the hell's going on in this country anymore.
Well, I certainly hope that you are correct about the prospects of her being released. Interestingly, just recently, you probably noticed that Tamara Lich was nominated to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, which says something about how our government is viewed internationally. But it also sets up a curious scenario in which it's possible that even if Tamara Lich were not restricted from going to Stockholm to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, which would be an incredible, in the normal situation, would be an incredible honor and something that all Canadians can and should be proud of. But even if she got to go to Stockholm to accept the award, that would constitute a violation of her bail terms. I mean, that emphasizes your point of how absurd this all is, right?
Well, but again, what really offended me about what happened is, let's not forget when the justice released her the last time, they hauled her in because she'd been invited to Toronto to accept the George Jonas Freedom Prize. And, and just the very fact that she'd been nominated and wanted to go to Toronto to accept this prize, the prosecutors were alleging, was a violation of bail terms, and we could have anarchy in the streets if Tamara was allowed to, go accept this prize. And that's when the judge said, look, the courts are not political thought police. The judge specifically permitted her to go to that event, and then the Crown turns around and uses an event that she's permitted to attend by the court as an excuse for throwing her in leg irons and hauling her ass across the country, to again be locked up, for more time than she would ever serve on this ridiculous mischief charge that they've levied against her.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's switch gears here. I want to get your take on something else here. Let's talk about the federal leadership race in terms of the Conservative Party. It's now looking like a one-horse race. Recently, the Conservative cabinet, the Conservative shadow caucus, over half of them now show support for Pierre Poilievre. He seems to be enormously popular right now, and the people like Jean Charest are sort of drifting to the background. Leslyn Lewis is in there, and she's fighting very hard, but she doesn't seem to have the broad level of support that Pierre Poilievre has. My question for you is this: as an Albertan, somebody who's focused upon the welfare of Western Canada, if Pierre Poilievre is elected and he becomes the next Prime Minister of Canada, let's say, within the foreseeable future, is that a solution to Western alienation in the context of the fact that just the other day a poll came out, and I think for the first time ever, independence is more popular in Alberta than it is in Quebec?
I'm glad that we're making some progress as well. And I was thrilled to see the poll numbers. I think our message is resonating and our message is getting through. To be clear, I mean, I'm happy to see Pierre Poilievre be elected as the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. That being said, that doesn't change my views whatsoever with regard to the need for Albertans to vote themselves out of Canada. And the structural imbalance and the fiscal imbalance, as between Alberta and the rest of the country, isn't going to change under a Conservative government. It's going to continue to be a fact that we send $60 billion a year to the federal government of Canada, while only having $27 billion of it returned to Alberta. Right? People are starting to internalize the fact that if Alberta declares independence tomorrow, we the wealthiest nation in the world on a GDP per capita basis, and we can easily afford to have a 10% flat income tax, 10% corporate tax in Alberta, just on the basis of the wealth of this province. And that's what people, I think, need to focus on. I mean, I'm glad that somebody has a chance of breaking through Montreal and the suburbs of Toronto and getting the Trudeau boot off of our throats, and having the gun removed from our head with regard to the destruction of the oil and gas industry under the Agenda 2030 program. Sure, I mean, but it's in the same way that I'm really happy, in the same way that somebody would be really happy to be given a couple Tylenol after their leg off. Right? It's it's a pretty short-term stopgap measure that ultimately will do little good in terms of the amount of damage that's been done as a province. And effectively, doesn't matter who's prime minister, the only effective way, I believe, or the most straightforward way to obtain a constitutional change in this province, and the only legal way to quickly obtain constitutional change is by 50% plus one of us voting for independence and getting the hell out of Canada. It's the only way that we're going to meaningfully change the Constitution of Canada that has been so stacked against Alberta from the start.
Okay, so by way of segue, let's handicap the UCP leadership race in Alberta. It's looking like there are 3 frontrunners now, all of whom support something called the Sovereignty Act. So let's start with this. I heard you speak in Airdrie recently at an APP event, and you give a very cogent explanation of what the Sovereignty Act is and why it won't work. Could you start there?
Yeah, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, there are elements of the Sovereignty Act that I support and that I think are necessary, that need to be done in any event to achieve Alberta independence. That includes, having an Alberta provincial police force. That includes having extending the powers to an Alberta Revenue Service to collect both income taxes and federal and provincial income taxes, etc. I think that's the time has come. Certainly, we need to replace the Canada Pension Plan, Alberta Pension, so that our seniors are reassured that when Alberta declares its independence, that there's going to be no interference with their pensions and their pension rights. And in fact, given the additional revenue that will accrue in Alberta, they'll be better off in Alberta than in as part of Canada, with the ever collapsing Canadian dollar, given the profligate spending Trudeau regime and the ongoing money printing of the Bank of Canada, right? So I see all of those elements of the Sovereignty Act, as supporting independence. But my concern with the people that are promoting the Sovereignty Act is that I think that that it's just more of the same nonsense that we've been hearing for years, including from people like Preston Manning, where they're whether it's the firewall strategy or West wants in or whatever it is that they've been talking about. It's all just more of the same, right? And to me, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. We're not respected by Eastern Canada. We saw that in spades during the peaceful freedom protest in Ottawa, where we called every name in the book, dirty, redneck, racist, misogynist, homophobic, extremist, you name it. This is how Western or Eastern Canadians think of Albertans. They think we're a joke. They think we're a bunch of dumb pickup truck driving rubes that that need to be told what to do by the elites of Toronto and Montreal. We can't be trusted to do anything on our own because we're all a bunch of idiots. It's time for us to get out of this abusive relationship with a partner that has zero respect for us as a people, and chart our own course going forward. So and I don't see the Sovereignty Act. The other thing about the Sovereignty Act is they talk about the fact that the Sovereignty Act itself might in fact be unconstitutional because it would provoke a constitutional crisis insofar as the province would attempt to collect federal taxes, and then that would cause problems for individuals who owe federal taxes and aren't paying them because the money's going to the province and all of those types, right? Well, far as I'm concerned, we don't need to provoke a constitutional crisis. We're already in one, right? We're being governed by a government in Canada that literally was elected by less than, they had, such a small percentage of the vote during the election, but we had such a low voter turnout. We're literally being governed by a government that had less than 15% of the popular vote. And by and large, that vote came from, the Maritimes and predominantly from the suburbs of Montreal and Toronto. So, to my way of thinking, we're in a constitutional crisis now, and both the Supreme Court of Canada and the Clarity Act, provide us a mechanism for getting out, which is that we have a referendum on a clear question, requires the government of Canada to negotiate with us, and to the extent that we're that we'll be negotiating with Pierre Poilievre as opposed to negotiating with Justin Trudeau, that may or may not be a benefit to us. But in any event, there's a clear legal constitutional forward, through a referendum process, and that's what I'm committed, to advocating, through the Alberta Prosperity Project. And I think the time is now. It's imminent, and we need to get on with it, right? And for all these people who say, oh well, even in the Sovereignty Act, they make it, they allude to the fact that there could be a referendum in the future. Well, what the hell's wrong with having one now? We're all adults. Why aren't we allowed to, in a binding manner, express our will as a population to the government on whether or not we want to remain in Canada, paying ever increasing tax rates, to fund boondoggles voted on by people in Toronto and Montreal, or do we want to be independent and keep all of our money at home and live in an increasingly prosperous Alberta with substantially lower taxes, as a result of the wealth of, what would be the independent, government of Alberta, right? Mm-hmm. That's, what I see the choice is. And I see the path forward as being very clear. And I certainly, as a fifth generation Albertan, see that at this point is the only thing that really makes sense.
Mm-hmm. We had Danielle Smith was one of the three front runners on this program recently, and she had some great ideas, particularly on COVID and on putting Alberta first. And she also said that she would not oppose a referendum occurring in Alberta. She would, as it were, respect the will of the people in that regard. But then more recently, she said publicly that she's not a separatist and she doesn't support separatism. Brian Jean is scheduled to be on this podcast, and I'm going to ask him some of the same questions I asked Danielle Smith. But from your point of view, whether it's Danielle Smith or Brian Jean or Mr. Taves, do you care who emerges as the winner, as the leader of the UCP, or are you just concerned about whether or not whoever sort of comes out of the chute is someone who is going to support the APP platform?
Well, I don't even care if they support the entire platform. I mean, I simply want a referendum. And everybody, and I'm not going to name names of any particular individuals, but a lot of the politicians that are, first of all, no, I will name names. Taves for me is a complete non-starter. He's a coward who basically kept his head down through,
Jeff, you're pulling punches again.
Well, our freedom ripped away from us, and wouldn't say, and I'm going to use, the harsh expression, wouldn't say shit if his mouth was full of it with regard to what was happening to us, in the province. And he's, I was just keeping my head down and keeping my powder dry for the day that I could be leader. Well, that's not leadership. Drinking booze on the top of the Sky Palace with Jason Kenney while they all yuck it up about how the locals are locked down while they're having a good time, to me isn't leadership. So, I mean, as far, and then on top of it, as far as Taves goes, he doesn't care about us. He cares about the status quo. Everything, he doesn't see that there's a problem with anything. I haven't heard him say anything other than, we have a bright and rosy future ahead of us. And he doesn't seem to understand the structural problems within Alberta itself and the need for constitutional reform within the province to do away with the Westminster form of government that we have in this province that allows people like Jason Kenney or Rachel Notley Trudeau to become the elected dictator of the province of Alberta 5 years at a time, where they get to internalize the fact that they control all of our resources and get to decide who benefits or doesn't benefit from our resources, right? Or the resources of Indigenous people in this province. I'm fed up with it, and I want complete structural change at a root constitutional level. And that's why I so strongly support APP, because obviously Alberta votes itself to become an independent republic. We're going to get a new constitution. We're going to have an elected legislature, an elected Senate, an elected executive, and perhaps even an elected judiciary. Mm-hmm. So, these are things that I'm, very passionate about. And I think that all of us would benefit.
It is very important, though, to have a leader in place who is going to resist the federal government's agenda on COVID-19 and COVID-19 vaccinations, though, isn't it? We just heard the other day it was announced that the federal health minister, honestly, I don't know why there is a federal health minister, because the federal government's not supposed to have any authority over health. But anyway, we heard the new definition of fully vaccinated is that that doesn't exist anymore. There's no such thing as fully vaccinated, and that Canadians, apparently all Canadians, are going to be expected to submit to this 9-month rotation of jabs. So it is important that we have somebody in power in Alberta who's going to stand up to this, isn't it?
Oh no, absolutely. Don't get me wrong on that. I think it goes without saying from my perspective that whatever leader we next elect needs to, I would like to see, them pass a Prevention of Medical Tyranny Act, and of course completely, rein in the authority of the Chief Medical Officer of Health, AHS, et cetera. The CPSA completely reformed, the College of Physicians and Surgeons to the degree that they've been complicit in all of the nonsense that's been going on in and around COVID, from threatening doctors for writing medical exemption letters, threatening doctors for prescribing life-saving treatments, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things looked at and need to be dealt with. My concern with Danielle Smith is she doesn't have a lot of credibility in rural Alberta. I don't think people in this province have actually forgiven her for, I think, being the only leader of opposition in the history of the Commonwealth to cross the floor and join the governing party for her own personal reasons. I don't think people have forgiven her for that, and I don't know that they should. Let's face it. The proper thing to do and the ethical thing for her to do, if she could no longer support the Wild Rose Party that she was a leader of, was to resign. Not to cross the floor. She was elected, to lead that party. And to the extent that she felt that there were people in that party that were too extreme, well, her obligation as leader was to resign, not to destroy the party from within by crossing the floor in advance of a provincial election, in the manner that she did. So, I think a lot of people out there are pretty bitter about that. And there's a lot of people out there who do not forgive her for that. And I wholeheartly agree with them. Mm-hmm. And I respect Danielle, and I respect her, a lot of her ideas. I think she was a strong voice on the COVID file, through COVID. But, she's already proven herself, not to be worthy of a leadership position. So I don't know why we'd give her one.
Would it change your mind at all if she took up with vigor the APP cause?
No.
I had to ask.
No. But quite frankly, it's the old, Dennis Modry talks about it. It's, let's find, it's all, Ralph Klein saying, let's find out which way the parade's going and run to the front of it and pretend to be leading it. So, Danielle Smith wants to pretend to be leading the APP parade, or the Alberta Prosperity Project parade. I don't accept it. I've been there from the beginning. with APP. I can tell you that Danielle has not attended any of our board meetings. I'm not aware that APP has openly endorsed her candidacy. I certainly don't. I haven't openly endorsed anyone yet with regard to their candidacy. I'm waiting to hear from any one of them as to whether they would support the idea of, forget the Alberta Sovereignty Act, let's pass an Alberta referendum, Independence Referendum Act. That every 5 years, starting, let's say after, in April of, or in 2023 or April of 2024, after the next time the equalization is supposed to be renegotiated, Albertans, every time the government of Canada treats us unfairly on equalization, we should be allowed to go to the polls and vote on whether we want to remain part of Canada. We should have our say, as to whether we want to continue in this abusive relationship, with Canada. Like, I have a Canadian passport right now that's not worth the goddamn written on, because you can't actually travel with it, and the government can revoke it at will and tell you can't fly. If, I'm waiting for them. Like, actually, and I think I wrote a column about that. Is I really want Trudeau and the Trudeau government to tell people they can't fly if they don't get the third shot or fourth shot or fifth shot. I think that at that point, finally, we might have a national revolt around these issues, because it's just so bloody arbitrary. Why is it 9 months? I mean, all the science seems to indicate that even the bloody booster wears off after 3 months, right? So what's ever going to be enough for these people?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, let's switch gears a little bit, and I want to dive a little bit into the APP. But before we go there, I want to talk to you about something called Unrip that's becoming a little bit controversial. And I know you are an expert in Indigenous law, and especially Indigenous rights, land rights law. You've been to the Supreme Court of Canada and won seminal cases. What is Unrip? There are those who, and of course, it's United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But there are some rumblings out there and the APP is actually being attacked. You're probably aware of this, for adopting Unrip, because the argument is that Unrip is a Trojan horse. That would result in the surrendering of a newly won Alberta sovereignty. In other words, we go from the frying pan into the fire, get away from Canada, start this new sovereign Republic of Alberta, and then surrender the new Alberta sovereignty to the United Nations. So
I think there's a really, really large gap, I think, of people's understanding, in and around these issues, right? The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is really nothing more or less than, a codification of customary international law as it applies to Aboriginal people, right? And in fact, it's been ratified by every country in the world now, including Canada, Australia, and the United States, which were amongst the holdouts on the issue, right? It forms part of Canadian law. As a matter of course, Alberta Prosperity Project has taken the view and understands that we're not likely to succeed in having the independence of Alberta recognized without the wholehearted support of Alberta's Indigenous people. And it's my position throughout, as reflected in the Alberta Prosperity Project Indigenous, Indigenous sovereignty proposal, that Indigenous people need to understand that when Alberta becomes independent, their rights as they exist now will be respected. And whether people like it or not, Unrip has passed into Canadian law. It's been incorporated into the law, provincial law of British Columbia. It's in part of the national law of Canada. We can't ask Aboriginal people to join an independent Alberta while telling them they're going to have fewer rights in Alberta than they would have if they would remain in Canada. The other thing is that people need to understand that in order to be recognized as an independent nation state, whether people like it or not, that means that means membership in the United Nations. Membership in the United Nations does not open it up for the United Nations to send in United Nations troops to trample, the individual sovereignty of individual nation states. If that were true right now, we would see a UN army in Ukraine, repulsing the Russians and pushing the Russians back into, over their border, right? So, this idea that somehow or other, Unrip opens the door to some, non-existent UN army, taking over Alberta and taking away our hard-won sovereignty, simply isn't true, and, is demonstrative of, I think, a lack of understanding on the part of people that are worried about that. The other thing is that, let's face it, I mean, the United Nations at the end of the day is a club. It's a club that the independent, government of Alberta, the independent Republic of Alberta, is going to be asking to join. We'll be seeking recognition by the United Nations, and it's pretty hard for us to seek recognition by the United Nations when we're not complying with the rules of the club and we're not prepared to sign on to, international instruments like, and it's not just under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, but it's the United Nations Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the United Nations Covenant on economic rights, the United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea. All of these things ultimately are to the benefit of citizens of Alberta. There's, with the United Nations, there's the good and the bad. We can't be afraid of, standing up and asking to be recognized as an independent nation state because we're afraid of some of the more negative aspects of globalism. I mean, the whole purpose behind the Alberta Prosperity Project, is to fight globalism and to protect Alberta from, globalist influences, from within the club or within the body of the United Nations as a member of the United Nations. So I don't think people need to be, afraid of that. And it's not, it's certainly not as terrifying as everybody makes it out to be. I mean, Canada has enacted it into federal law. It hasn't brought resource development in Canada to a screeching halt. It's been enacted into the law of British Columbia. It hasn't brought forestry, logging, oil and gas development, or anything else in British Columbia to a screeching halt, et cetera, et cetera. So I think all of the concerns around the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, are overly inflated, and people need to understand that we're not going to be able to achieve sovereignty or independence without recognition of Unrip or the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as being the prevailing international law as it pertains to Indigenous people and the rights of the individual Indigenous nations in the province of Alberta. So hopefully that's, it's a fairly long-winded answer, but, that's my, that's my response with regard to Unrip. And I've been trying to find a way to respond to that question without being overly, overly annoyed by it, because, there's an element of people, who support APP, but, initially, we're supporting, the concept of independence on the idea that somehow or other independence is this magical fairy wand that you can wave in the air and make Indians disappear, right? And the simple fact of the matter is that, the Alberta Prosperity Project understands that Alberta will never achieve independence without the wholehearted support of Alberta's, sovereign Indigenous nations. And that's why, we take the position that we're taking, and we're putting forward, the policies that we're putting forward. And it's actually written right into the Clarity Act. In recognizing the independence of any individual province that votes for separation, that the federal government must take into account the views and interests of the Aboriginal people within an individual province wishing to separate. So, we're simply not going to achieve independence without respect for the existing rights of Alberta's Indigenous people. And the good news for everybody, in terms of all of this, is that we're well going to be able to afford it with the extra $33 billion a year we're going to be reclaiming from Ottawa. And we're going to be unfettering the Alberta economy by getting rid of, foolishness like the carbon tax, federal overregulation of oil and gas development, in the tar sands area, like the recent refusal of the federal environment minister to approve the expansion of the Suncor, mine, those types of things, will be, behind us. And, the Indigenous people of Alberta will share, will become a very prosperous future for everybody, including Alberta's Indigenous people, who APP, as a matter of policy, will recognize to regulate gaming on their own reserves, engage in online, that they choose to do so, and fully function, as sovereign, governments in partnership with the government of an independent Alberta, within a constitutional framework and a rule of law that respects everyone's rights, including the individual rights of members of Alberta's Indigenous nations. So, I see this as a very positive way forward. It's going to hopefully resolve all of these issues by and large once and for all in a fair and equitable way that takes into account everyone's rights, the rights and interests of everyone. We move forward. We move forward in that manner.
Well, I think everyone can agree that the relationship, or perhaps a better way of putting it, the treatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada and that relationship with the federal government, with governments, has been dysfunctional, and that it needs to change. And I think,
look at Trudeau, $10 million to expand a runway in Tofino so that he can puke jet fuel all over the pristine Pacific Coast rainforest for him and all of his rich buddies to fly their private jets in Tofino to go surfing on their $10 million beach houses while they're thumbing their nose at the Aboriginal people below them still don't have clean drinking water. It's a country that we currently live in, and it's not a country that I'm particularly proud of.
And so the APP, the difference with the APP is in terms of the relationship between, let's call it, the state and Indigenous peoples. The difference between that and what exists now fundamentally will be what would you say to people who are saying, okay, Jeff, this is all going to be different? How is it going to be different?
Well, I think the framework that the APP is putting in place and that we're engaged in consultation with Aboriginal people around is the idea that that Aboriginal people or Indigenous people of Alberta are for once finally going to be partners, in the governance of the province of Alberta. So, and their interests and their views and their, and their aspirations and their real interests in land and resources, et cetera, will be respected by the government of Alberta. I mean, one of the things that, is set out in the APP policy is, that a requirement for resource revenue sharing with Alberta's Indigenous people, will be constitutionalized within the framework of a constitution to be developed for an independent Alberta. And I mean, this is something that First Nations people have had a right to for, since the treaties were entered into, and has always been ignored by various governments who by and large has built, a very, very nice civilization on the backs of Indigenous people who've been forced to live in poverty. So, I mean, these are changes we can well afford, because we're no longer going to be sending $10 or $12 billion a year to Quebec so that people in Quebec can have subsidized $5 a day universal daycare, while the working moms and dads of Alberta struggle to make ends meet, while Trudeau continues to arbitrarily hammer their home prices or whatever he does by, with the various attacks that he levies against the provincial economy. I mean, those are the types of things that we want to get out, ahead of. Something else as well with regard to APP, and just moving off the subject of, the Indigenous file for a minute. People need to understand, people that are attached to their Canadian identity and their Canadian citizenship, they're going to retain their Canadian citizenship. We're all going to be dual citizens at the end of the day. We'll be citizens of an independent Alberta, and we're going to be, we'll continue to be citizens of Canada. So for those Albertans that want to go, to Toronto and want to earn a living in, other places in Canada and pay the 60% tax rates that the government of Canada is going to be forced to levy, to, continue to survive profligate nature of, its spending, people will be free to leave Alberta and pay 60% tax as opposed to staying in Alberta and paying 10% tax. And as citizens of Alberta, they'll always be welcome home. If they think that a better living somewhere else, paying, giving up 60% of their income, to, the Canadian government as opposed to, only paying a 10% tax in Alberta, right? I mean, we're a free people. We've always been a free people. It's all about choices. And if people choose to work in Canada and give the Canadian government 60% of their hard-earned income, they'll be free to do that.
You are part of your role with the APP is as the sort of legal thinker at the board level. And one of the things that one of the ideas you have that I think most people would find shocking and even controversial is your view of the traditional political party system. Could you expound upon that?
Yeah, I mean, I think most people know I have an honors degree in political science, and I have an honors degree in law from the London School of Economics. And over the years, I really, I've been involved in politics. And I've really come to the opinion, and I think it's an opinion shared by a lot of Canadians, that political parties, by and large, are corrupt, and that political parties, by and large, are nothing more or less than an entity that interposes themselves between the individual citizen and the government, of the country in a way that is antithetical to the needs and the well-being of individual citizens, right? So in my view, in a perfect world, under the Constitution of a new Alberta, I would be seeking to outlaw political parties, on the basis that we should have direct democracy, individual members of the legislature, individual members of the Senate, and individual members of, what I would hope would be an executive council, because I'd also like to see us do away with the concept of a president or prime minister, and instead have a council so that no one person thinks they control all of the resources of the province. But anyway, getting back to the political party issue, I would prefer a system where each member of the legislature or Senate is directly accountable to the people in the riding that elected them, and that those people could affect a by-election and haul that person back to explain themselves to the voters on his 50,000 online vote. Because at the end of the day, I really think that elected officials should be responsive to the people that elected them, and not to some corrupted political structure, that serves the will or serves the interests of the premier or the prime minister, as opposed to serving the benefit of the people, right? So let's take as an example the recent Kenney debacle with regard to, the leadership review. Everybody involved in that and everybody in and around that knew that if the vote had been held on April 9th in Red Deer, that Jason Kenney would have been thrown out on his ear with less than 25% support from the people that were registered to vote in person on April 9th. That was where all the internal polling was going. That was, all the votes that, were coming in from, from the province. People were angry. The people were angry and wanted Jason gone because of the degree to which he trampled the rights and completely vitiated the concept of responsible government in this province. Now, of course, we all know what happened. Kenney's hand-picked, hand-appointed board of the UCP, which I now refer to as the United Corruption Party, but the board of the United Corruption Party got together and changed the rules in midstream and said, oh, no, we can't have that. Oh, let's open this up to mail-in ballots, where Jason Kenney is the only person that can, that can actually access, the party mailing lists and all these types of things. And notwithstanding that, could still only garner 51% support. Those of us, again, that were close to it, suspect that the real number, if you started going through the credit cards and figuring out all the rules that were, his support was still likely not more than 30%, right? All of that, to my opinion, was completely improper. And the fact that he's still continuing to hold on, running the shredders in Edmonton, until October, is, to my way of thinking, completely antithetical to, transparency and democracy, and something that I would like to see change for the benefit, of my daughter and future, citizens of Alberta. I think, get away from a corrupt party system. And keep in mind, when I talk about a corrupt party system, I'm not just going to point fingers at the UCP. Look at the NDP and the degree to which, Rachel Notley and the union bosses, run that party, for the benefit of the union bosses rather than working Albertans. Like, I can't even tell you how many heartbroken phone calls that I received through COVID from union members who were on the verge of losing their jobs because they were unable to be vaccinated for numerous reasons, religious, medical, conscience, whatever. And, were in tears that they were losing their jobs, and their goddamn unions weren't lifting a finger to help them because, Rachel Notley, Trudeau, and all the union bosses decided that they were going to support the WEF and the vaccine mandates, over the needs of their membership and the individual working class members of the union. So, so don't think for a second that, my disdain for political parties, stops with the UCP. I think one party is as bad as the next. And I think it's time for all of them outlawed and gotten rid of, as organizations corrupt democracy rather than promote it. And, I would like to see it forward into the future, without any political parties, because I really think that they are not agents of good. And I think they're, that the inherent corruption that you see within the party process, should be done away with in an independent Alberta.
So the political party system sort of interferes with protection of the rule of law, right? So
the rule of law, and the direct expression of the democratic will of the people that have elected individual MLAs. Like, how many times? Trudeau wouldn't continue to be prime minister if we didn't have a party system. I mean, they had to bring in a 3-line whip on the Emergencies Act declaration because there were any number of members of his own party that weren't going to support him on that. And we vote on the Emergencies Act declaration, both amongst the Liberals and the NDP. It's not likely that it would have passed in the House of Commons. Clearly, we saw what was going on in the Senate. It wasn't going to pass in the Senate, and it was for that reason that Trudeau was forced to rescind the Emergencies Act announcement.
Right. So we talked about some of these features of the Constitution that you're fashioning for the new Alberta. Of course, we talked about protection of Indigenous rights. We've talked about protection of health rights. We've talked about abolition of the traditional political party system. You mentioned earlier, you alluded to not having a leader like a prime minister or president. What are the other essential features that you see need to be part of a new constitution that would be the legal foundation for the Republic of Alberta?
Sure, and just to back up for a second, I'm not the only one crafting, the Constitution, the draft Constitution for the province of Alberta. We're putting together, a constitutional drafting committee that includes, a number of, of esteemed legal counsel in the province of Alberta, including a very prominent and knowledgeable Queen's Counsel by the name of Leighton Grey, who's on the committee. Rob Anderson, who was involved in coming up with the Alberta strategy, to join us on the drafting committee. A lawyer by the name of Kylie Johnson up in Edmonton, will be involved on the draft.
Just met her. Very nice lady.
Yeah, and quite frankly, it's an open invitation to anybody that would like to meet with us or and join us, in providing input and their ideas. Please contact us, in that regard. And then at the end of the day, the Constitution that's being prepared, ultimately isn't going to be, a Constitution that the committee itself, will be putting forward. Ultimately, the plan, I think, is either, in this fall or moving into to have a constitutional convention in somewhere in the province, maybe Red Deer, somewhere central, where any citizen of the province of Alberta, can come and express views with regard to with regard to the new Constitution constitution for for an independent Republic of Alberta. It'd also be my hope that we could then have a constitutional inquiry or discussion where the document could then be traveled around the province to various halls and obtain consult with communities in Alberta, including the Indigenous nations of Alberta, with regard to the form of the Constitution prior to it being passed, along with a referendum vote, so that people, actually have ownership, of the, of the new Constitution of the province of Alberta. I'd like this to be a grassroots exercise where people, at every level of society feel that they have, input into what the final, supreme law of the province of Alberta is going to look like, and go forward on that basis. So, just to back up for a minute and then to answer your question, and these are just my thoughts, with regard to having an executive council, whether we want to call it a presidium or, whatever we want to call it, as opposed to having a president or a prime minister of an independent, of an independent Alberta. And, my thinking in and around that, arises out of this concern that I have that comes from the fact that, we have people like Pierre Trudeau, we have people like Jason Kenney, we have people like Rachel Notley Trudeau, who, who have these despotic tendencies that want to rule as if they are, basically an elected dictator, 5 years at a time, making decisions, as to what happens to resources in this province, as if, these resources belong to them, as opposed to all of the people of the province, and where these individuals, are then lobbied by groups like Wellington Advocacy and all these other shadow lobby groups, in the background, which incidentally I would seek to outlaw as well, right? From the standpoint of, preventing actual citizens of this province from having equal access, to government, as these big moneyed interests that hire these special interest lobbying groups. Like, you can bet that Jason Kenney's already got his lobbying gig out, for when he leaves office. To my way of thinking, this is not how, good governance and transparent governance should operate. And, I would like to see all of that change on a going forward basis. And I don't like, from a psychological perspective, that any one individual should see themselves as the elected dictator or the elected king, of Alberta going forward into the future. So if you had a council of 5 people with a rotating chairmanship where it rotated every month, and they, decided all, issues by either consensus or a vote amongst the council, I think that would go a long way towards doing away with this idea that you've got one individual who, literally operates as if they're, the king of Alberta. And we've seen how that worked under Jason Kenney, not very well. So I would like to see that change. And then the other thing from a psychological perspective as well, does away with, the danger of individual demagogues, becoming leader of the province. You've got an individual with, someone like Justin Trudeau, who comes along and people think he's handsome and people think he's charismatic, and he gets elected to the destruction of this entire country on the basis of, his perceived charm and good looks. I don't think that that's a recipe for responsible government. And, quite clearly in this age of Twitter and social media and the rest of all of that noise that has, I think negatively impacted on our democracy, going to, an executive council model, again, directly accountable to the people, with anyone being able to be removed for a by-election, to be forced to hold a by-election on 50,000 votes, in the province, I think would make them all a lot more consultative and a lot more concerned with the views of the people who elected them, as opposed to, what we've been dealing with here over the last couple of years.
So under the,
I'm looking forward to having a dialogue.
oh yeah, yeah. Under this this new concept, and I'm just fleshing this out a little bit with you just to get your thoughts. I realize we're kind of brainstorming here, but do you envision, for example, a bicameral legislature with both sides of the legislature being elected, sort of like what exists in the United States? Is that what you have, what you would foresee or what you would support?
I think we need significantly more checks and balances than we currently we need significantly more checks and balances than we currently have. We currently have none, as far as I'm concerned. What checks and balances, exist for Jason, for, I was going to call him Jason Trudeau. I think it's close enough. Referring to Rachel Notley as Rachel Trudeau, since the marriage of Jagmeet, the same-sex marriage of Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau in that field. I think one of them is as bad as the next, and I think we need to get away from that. We need to rein in, this governance by single individuals, who are, more easily swayed, or, corrupted or bent, to special interests rather than serving the interests of the province as a whole.
Mm-hmm. So just again, sort of drilling down on this APP idea, because I think it's important for people to understand this. Why is the 2023 provincial election in Alberta so crucial? Dr. Modry says repeatedly that it's the most important election in our history. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think it's really important. And that's why I've been careful not to endorse any single candidate at this point. We have to make sure as a province that we elect a government that will have a referendum within a year of being elected. Mm-hmm. And, I will support whatever candidate is prepared to do that. And I haven't seen anybody come out yet and make that clear statement.
Even Danielle Smith?
You know what? I mean, I hate to say it, but yeah, if Danielle Smith came out and clearly promised in a manner that she couldn't flip-flop or backpedal, that she would hold a referendum, within a year of being elected, on Alberta independence, I would consider supporting Danielle Smith. But I mean, I want to hear a clear, unequivocal statement from whatever candidate it is that I support. For that reason. And I think it is the most important election in Alberta's future. People need to understand 2030 is right around the corner. And we're going to be facing increasing levels of chaos unlike anything we have, that we've ever seen. A lot of these new rules that are coming in, like they're literally talking about shutting down, diesel trucks and switching over to, electric tractor trailers and trucks and on and on and on. I mean, the machinery hasn't even been invented yet, and they're talking about forcing everybody to switch over before 2030. What do you think that's going to do to the supply chain? And this is California in particular I'm talking about right now. But I mean, what do you think that's going to do to the supply chain? Right? I mean, we have a number of significant challenges that are facing us, not the least of which is Justin Trudeau threatening to destroy the Alberta oil and gas economy on the basis of what the Auditor General of Canada has criticized for being fanciful notions about non-existent hydrogen technology somehow magically coming along and saving the day, right? I mean, all of these people in and around Trudeau are engaged in, completely magical thinking on these issues. Like, I heard one idiot, I blotted his name from my memory. I was watching CPAC one day. I think you've heard me talk about this before. Who was a Liberal who claimed to have drafted the green energy plan for Western Canada. And he's going, "Oh my God, in drafting this plan, we realized that there's nothing you can't do with a barrel of canola oil that you can do with a barrel of petroleum," right? And well, first of all, that's bullshit, because all of our plastic plants, all of the things that make all of the various parts go into automobiles out of plastics. I mean, we're not making them out of canola oil. And then just for fun, I Googled the spot price of a barrel of canola oil on that day, $1,018 a barrel, right? So, and I'll use the word again, these complete idiots think that we're going to be harvesting crops, crops to market. People are going to be driving to and from work, all these kinds of things on our economy is going to continue to function on $1,018 a barrel oil. Let alone like trying to explain to people how our power grid is going to hold up if everybody's trying to plug in their electric vehicle. All of these people are literally just made up a complete nonsense that they expect the rest of us to buy into, when none of it has any hope in hell of actually succeeding, other than to the extent that they're trying to implement this stuff piece by piece. We now see the devastation that it's causing across our economy. And some of it's COVID related, but let's just look at the stupidity of forcing pilots to get vaccinated against their will. So how many pilots quit because they didn't want to get vaccinated? And then how many pilots have we now lost because they can't fly because they've been vaccine injured? And lo and behold, there isn't, Canadians are no longer free to travel within their own country because Trudeau and his transportation minister, I think his name is Abracadabra, I'm not sure, he's some sort of magician, thinks that he can magically make planes fly in the air without pilots. It just beggars belief that this is the stupidity that we're forced to labor under.
We have found a way to resist this stuff, though, haven't we? We sort of learned this from the truckers, and that is to simply stand up and resist it. And this was successful recently in preventing these labels, these warning labels, to be put on packages of beef. And now, right now, as we said, even though no major media outlets are covering it, there's a huge protest going on in Holland, right? So there is a way to resist this stuff. Do you support that type of populist resistance, or do you think that there's a more effective way to resist government overreach?
When I was in university, I read a book, and I'm probably completely slaughtering the pronunciation of it, but I think it was the rough pronunciation is Saskatchewan in South Africa. But it was a book about peaceful resistance written by Mohandas K. Gandhi when he was a barrister in South Africa.
Never heard of that guy.
Yeah, exactly. Gandhi. And I guess if he was in Ottawa, Trudeau had been trying to trample him with a horse as well, right? Same way that he did that poor Indigenous woman. But but that's what Gandhi was saying, is that in the face of fascism and totalitarianism, we have a duty to stand up, and we have a duty to sit down on the road and say, no, I will not move, right? And last I heard, Mohandas K. Gandhi, one of the most respected leaders of the 20th century, and I fully support the path of peaceful protest and peaceful non-compliance with totalitarianism, which is what we're moving towards. Like, people talk about social credit in China. Like, what is a vaccine passport other than the imposition of a social credit system in Canada? If you're a good boy and girl and get vaccinated, you're allowed to fly on airplanes. You're allowed to take trains. You're allowed to go on boats. You're allowed to travel freely in your country, and you're allowed to go on holiday. Oh, but if you're a bad person and your conscience, your religion, your doctor tells you it's not safe to get injected with, a vaccine that has numerous documented side effects, then you're a bad person and you shouldn't be allowed to fly and you shouldn't travel and you shouldn't be allowed to go on holiday. We have social credit in Canada right now. It's despicable. This is not Canada.
Well, but we're not going to have any of that in the new sovereign Alberta, though, correct?
No, absolutely not. I mean, we will have a strong charter of rights, within the province of Alberta, and and there will be carefully drawn, rules of interpretation, for the judiciary with regard to how they're allowed to implement or not, the rights and freedoms of the citizens of Alberta, with with the courts always to err on the side of the citizen rather than on the side of the government. We can't continue to go on the way that we've been going on, where just continue to destroy businesses, cause people to be bankrupted, drive people into economically driven suicides. This cannot continue to go on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm not going to name names, but I got news, you know, the other week that a businessman that I know in Edmonton was driven to suicide by Dr. Hinshaw. You know, Dr. Hinshaw's orders, devastating a business that he built over 40 years of his life. You know, and, you know, it breaks my heart that this is what's going on in this province, and never again, will I, allow this to continue. You know, I will fight this type of tyranny with my last breath, for the rest of my life. This should never be allowed to happen again in this province. You know, and I think, the only way to ensure that it doesn't is a complete constitutional overhaul of this province that begins with a vote to declare our independence from Canada. And I know we're coming up on an hour and 30. So, and again, I just want to finish with the thought that from my perspective, Alberta, we aren't separatists. So we're not saying that, that Alberta should separate from Canada. My view is that Canada's already separated from Alberta. When Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act earlier this year on spurious grounds, after calling Albertans every dirty name in the book, as far as I'm concerned, Trudeau separated Canada from Alberta, and a vote for independence is to simply give effect to the fact that Trudeau himself has separated Canada from the province, and it's simply just time to give effect to that and protect the futures of our children.
That's a great point. In fact, I've said at some of the events to people that the second P, prosperity, could also be preservation, and that really, as I understand the APP platform, what it's about is really, as you put it, preserving the best parts of Canada for future generations. Because if we stay in this country, if Alberta stays in this country, all of that culture, all that history, all of that we hold dear, the best parts of ourselves and our history will all be lost through this globalist nihilism, and really that's sort of implicit in the concept of prosperity, is this idea that we're preserving the best parts, the beautiful parts of Canadian culture. And so it's not a separatist movement at all. It's actually it's getting the best parts, and it's getting as many people as we can out of the house alive. That's how I view it.
I prefer to refer to it as an independence movement, as opposed to a separatist movement. Like I said, one, Canada's already separated from us, and two, I really see that to the extent that Canada no longer, the Canadian government's no longer recognize the values espoused by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that it's time for Alberta to chart its own course. Because quite frankly, as we all know, freedom equals prosperity. Our prosperity, our freedom, and and people that haven't internalized this need to, and that is government interference in people's lives, over-regulation by government, ongoing micromanagement by governments, completely destroys prosperity. It doesn't create it.
Right.
And if people are looking for a better life for their children, freedom and independence is the way forward, not ongoing, despotism, that we're living under. I mean, did anybody think 3 years ago that Trudeau was going to manage within a year or two to bring the Chinese social credit system into Canada? I mean, it just completely beggars belief that this is where we're at as a country now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of Dr. Milton Friedman: the smaller the government, the larger the individual.
Well,
anyway,
not even. But I was talking with somebody the other day, and they said, "Well, Jeff, this whole idea of you've got these checks and balances in a legislature, and a Senate, and executive council, and how's government going to get anything done?" I said, "That's the whole point. I don't want government to get anything done. I want less government, not more government."
They don't do anything. They don't do anything particularly well, do they?
Governments can't be trusted to get much right, and I think we've seen that in spades over the last 2.5 years.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, we're so grateful to have you here. I know you've said a whole bunch of things that hopefully you won't regret, but it's been, again, a very, very fascinating conversation, almost a true sequel to the one that we had before. But you've really gotten into some great stuff here that I think people are going to be able to take with them. And in that vein, in terms of taking something with you, in honor of you, my reading list today is one of your favorite books, one that you refer to often. It's an ancient one. It's called The Prince by the Italian philosopher Machiavelli. So this is actually an essay, and the summary here from Amazon reads as follows: there have been many political philosophies published throughout the time of literate man, but few have made such an impact in so few words as Machiavelli's The Prince. This eminently quotable treatise on the nature of rulers is unsettling in that it does not merely discuss the specific political geography of 16th century Europe, a world comprised of kings and nobles who ruled absolutely, is endured for nearly 500 years, because it is an all-encompassing understanding of men in power and the common traits, motives, and struggles which have characterized leaders from Roman emperors to modern day presidents. And Jeff, do you want to add a book to that, or do you want to give us your favorite quotation from The Prince?
Well, one of my favorites still is, I think I made it on the last podcast, is the comment in The Prince that, and the Florentines were easily conquered because they had become weak and effeminate from long peace.
Right.
Sometimes when I despair for our society when I look at how soft we've become as a country, and I think that we need to get back to understanding that government is not the solution to all of our problems. We are the solution to our problems, and we need to work together, in communities of like-minded people, to make our lives better within Alberta. So, I think that's kind of where I'm going from. The other book, and I think I mentioned it the last time, I'm still reading Donald J. Savoy's book. On the collapse of accountability in Canadian government, and I think I think there's a real cautionary tale there for Pierre Poilievre. So I mean, Pierre may not be an acolyte of the WEF, but I certainly hope that Pierre Poilievre goes back to governing through caucus and governing through Parliament, and doesn't fall into the same trap or the same conduct that Trudeau and Jason Kenney are guilty of, which is governing through a small little group of trusted courtiers, and sycophants that that will continually suck up to them and tell them what they want to hear, as opposed to listening to his caucus, governing through Parliament, being accountable to our democratic institutions. And I certainly hope that he looks at leadership, or looks at his leadership campaign and his inner circle, and weeds out his inner circle of any WEF acolytes, anybody with connections to groups like Wellington Advocacy, and all these shadowy, shadowy special interest lobbyists in the background, that I think corrupt government. I was also, and this is just an aside, but I was also interested in hearing Pierre Poilievre the other day talking about Magna Carta, and I always tell you that story that Magna Carta is always quoted or referred to by people who've obviously never read the damn thing. Magna Carta, to my way of thinking, is not the way forward. Just to be clear, Magna Carta isn't a high point of democracy where the individual peasants were able to stand up to the king. It was the barons reasserting their feudal rights over their feudal lands in the face of a weak king. And so the things that they were asserting the rights to was their right to fish in their streams and the wildlife in their forests, which meant the rights of the barons to murder their peasants who would have the temerity to poach, the rights of the barons to rape peasant women on their wedding nights, the rights of the barons, right, to not repay Jewish moneylenders. I mean, all of that stuff's in Magna Carta. So people that tout Magna Carta as a high point of freedom maybe should go and read the document and understand that I think Magna Carta is the root of the problem rather than the root of the solution. And then I think that the real way forward is through direct democracy, where we, the peasants, are the ones that are governing, and that we are able to express our direct will upon who are elected by us to serve us as public servants, as opposed to all of us being treated like subjects, who are being governed by those of us who are somehow divinely ordained to be our betters and overlords. So I think that the time has come to put Magna Carta to bed, and and actually allow the Commons to rule. So anyway, that's my.
It occurred to me while you were giving that explanation that on one view of the matter, this Sovereignty Act, proposed Sovereignty Act, is sort of like a Magna Carta, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of a continuation of that. As far as I'm concerned, I think it's time for that. And I said this before, that COVID was a massive stress test for our democratic institutions in Canada, and all of our democratic institutions have failed. So I think it's time for a complete overhaul of all of the democratic institutions in Canada. And I think for Alberta, the quickest and easiest constitutional way forward is a strong vote for independence, and to hopefully empower what I hope to be the last political party in Alberta to enact the new Alberta Constitution that would outlaw political parties, put in place a form of direct democracy that would protect and preserve the rights of the individual citizens of Alberta once and for all.
Well, and that shall be the last word. Thank you so much for being here, Jeff. We're so grateful. It's always a pleasure to listen to you and to get your thoughts, have you explain things. And I think anybody coming away from this hopefully has learned a great deal, especially about APP, why, as you say, it's the only way forward for Alberta, and indeed for Canada. I think Canada needs the break. As you say, they've already separated. So thanks again for being with us. It's been a real pleasure as always, and we'll look forward to the next time.
All right. Well, thank you, Leighton. Always a pleasure.
Okay.